The dining hall went quiet 4 seconds before anyone screamed. Merrick noticed it first, the way the room's noise dropped out from under itself, like someone had pulled a plug. 3 tables over, Atrix Vaughncore was leaning down toward a seated human boy. His dorsal ridges flared a deep, angry red. Merrick's inner membranes fluttered. This was not new. This had been happening for months, this exact shape of moment, and every time Merrick's body braced for something that never came. Ryan Aldrich did not move. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed somewhere past Atrix's shoulder, the same blank patience he wore every single day on Harmony Station. He hadn't spoken since the 4th cycle of the term. Not once. Not to defend himself, not to answer a teacher's question out loud if he could write it instead, not even to say excuse me when someone shoved past him in the corridor. That was about to change. Harmony Station spun slowly above the tin system, a wheel of glass and steel holding 39 species and one deeply unwanted human delegation inside careful, scheduled peace. 5 years since Earth had sent its first students here. 5 years, and the file on Terran behavioral risk still red, mitigated only by protocol after protocol after protocol. Protocols were supposed to stop things like this. They hadn't. Atrix straightened to his full 2 meters, gill folds at his neck fluttering with something that looked, to Merrick, almost like pleasure. He said something low. Ryan's expression did not change. Then Ryan's arm came up. It happened too fast to be a flinch and too controlled to be panic. His elbow drove forward and up, catching Atrix under the jaw, and the sound that followed was small and wet and final, a wrong little pop that did not belong in a school dining hall. Atrix's knees buckled. His secondary arms spasmed once. He went down sideways across the table, and nobody in the room breathed. Ryan sat back down. He exhaled slowly through his nose, the way a person does after setting down something heavy. His hands had not left the table the entire time. He reached into his jacket pocket, drew out a small folded square of medical-grade polyfilm, and laid it flat in front of him like he'd been carrying it for weeks, which Merrick would later learn he had. Then Ryan raised his hand, the same calm half-raise he used in class when he wanted to be called on. "I'd like to report a defense incident," he said. His voice was flat, and even the first full sentence anyone had heard him say in over a month. Justified under Article 7, Clause 4. Nobody moved to help Atrix. Nobody moved at all. Merrick stood frozen by the drink dispensers, watching the boy who never reacted to anything sit perfectly still beside the body of the boy who had never once been told no. The first snowfall on Harmony Station would come 3 weeks after this moment. Of course, it wasn't real snow. Nothing on the station was real, not the gravity, not the seasons, not the careful piece stitched between 39 species who mostly just wanted to be left alone. But the snow would fall anyway, soft and white, and dissolving before it touched the ground, and Merrick would think, watching it, that it looked exactly like the silence Ryan carried with him everywhere. Beautiful. Cold. Gone before you could hold it. But that was still 3 weeks away. Right now, there was only the sound of Atrix's labored breathing and the low hum of the station's climate system, indifferent to what had just happened 30 meters beneath it. You'll want to hear how this started. Trust me on that. 8 cycles earlier, room 112B had been unusually quiet during early rest phase. Deathworlders had never mixed well with the rest of the galaxy's species, not since the first contact reports came back describing what Terran biology could survive. Harmony Station's administrators had built an entire wing of protocols just to manage it. None of them had accounted for a boy who simply absorbed everything and gave nothing back. The desks in 112B were hexagonal, bonded to the floor in case of sudden gravitic failure, a holdover from an older design philosophy nobody had bothered to update. The air carried a faint sterile tang, sterilization bots working overtime to mask the heavy musk-crashing students left behind wherever they sat in groups. Ryan sat alone near the back, hands folded, eyes forward. He had not spoken since the 4th cycle. Merrick had researched humans extensively by then. None of it explained him. He just sits there, Merrick's lab partner Fawn said one afternoon, all six of her limbs clicking in a shrug that meant she found the whole subject mildly fascinating and mostly irrelevant. Itrix knocked his tray over yesterday. Whole thing, soup and everything. He picked it up, didn't say a word. Maybe he's developmentally stunted, someone else offered, not unkindly, just the kind of casual cruelty species used when they didn't understand something and needed it to make sense anyway. Merrick didn't think that was it. Merrick had watched Ryan's eyes during the tray incident. They had not looked stunted. They had looked like they were counting something. Ryan filed his first complaint through the student feedback interface that same week. It was closed within 2 days, no escalation, a standard auto-response thanking him for his engagement with the Harmony community standards. He filed a second one 9 days later, after a Trix shoved him hard enough into a corridor wall that the impact rattled a maintenance panel loose. That one was closed in 6 hours. Nobody on the inquiry board ever read either one. Not until much later, in a room with a privacy field humming overhead, when it would finally matter that 2 pieces of paper had said, quietly and uselessly, help. For now, the dining hall was just a dining hall, and Ryan sat at the center table where everyone could see him, which Merrick found strange. Most prey animals hid. Ryan never did. He picked the most visible seat in the room and ate his meals there every single day, watching the door. Itrix found him there during mid-cycle recess, flanked by 2 of his bloodline mates, dorsal ridges already flushed pink with anticipation. "Didn't see you there, bone sack," Itrix said, and knocked Ryan's tray clean off the table with one of his half-developed secondary arms. Ryan watched it fall. Then he knelt, gathered the spilled food back onto the tray with 2 efficient motions, and sat back down. He did not look up at Itrix. He did not look away from him either. He simply continued eating from what was left, as if the interruption had cost him nothing at all. Merrick's membranes fluttered hard enough to be visible from across the hall. "Why doesn't he report it?" Fawn asked later, watching Merrick stare at the spot where it happened. "He has," Merrick said, though Merrick didn't actually know that yet, not for certain. It was a guess, the kind you make about someone who behaves like a person keeping very careful records. The shoves continued in the corridors, casual and constant, the kind of thing that left no mark anyone could point to. Ryan absorbed each one and blinked, slow and deliberate, like he was filing it somewhere instead of feeling it. 3 days after the tray, Itrix found a new angle, the xenobiology lab. A beaker of solvent went sideways across the workbench, close enough to splash Ryan's sleeve. Ryan didn't flinch. He raised his hand, asked the instructor for a med wipe in the same flat tone he used for everything, cleaned his arm, and returned to his stool. He didn't glance at Itrix once. That was the moment Merrick started really watching. Not out of suspicion, out of something closer to dread, the kind you feel when you realize a pattern has a shape and you can't yet see where the shape ends. The corridor shove came 2 days after the lab incident, sharper than the others, hard enough that Ryan's shoulder caught the edge of a maintenance panel and left a thin scrape along his jacket sleeve. He didn't rub it. He didn't look back at Itrix's retreating laugh, the 2 bloodline mates flanking him like an honor guard. He just kept walking, the same pace, the same posture, hands loose at his sides. Merrick was 20 meters back, on the way to a different lecture, and stopped cold in the corridor. "That one was harder," Merrick said later, finding Fawn in the botanical dome between classes. "They're always harder," Fawn said, clicking 2 of her limbs together in something like a shrug. Crashing adolescents test boundaries until something pushes back. Nothing's pushed back, so they keep going. It was the most useful thing anyone had said about it, and Merrick turned it over for the rest of the day. Nothing's pushed back. Not the school's protocols, which closed Ryan's complaints faster than they were filed. Not Ryan himself, who absorbed every hit like a recorder logging data nobody would ever ask to see. Something about that felt less like passivity and more like a long, patient countdown, though Merrick couldn't have said to what. Dean Holloway, the station's Terran-accredited administrator, called Ryan into her office that same week. a brief routine wellness check required after any reported physical contact between students. Ryan sat across from her, hands folded the same way they always were. "You're doing fine," she asked. It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of thing adults said when they needed permission to stop worrying. "I'm doing fine," Ryan said. She didn't ask anything else. The meeting lasted 4 minutes. Ryan walked out, and Dean Holloway closed the file, and somewhere in that closing, a third complaint that had never been filed went unwritten because Ryan had stopped expecting the form to do anything at all. The dining hall confrontation came on a Thursday, by the station's arbitrary calendar, the kind of day that felt no different from any other until it wasn't. Itrix crossed the hall with his usual loose, confident gait, dorsal ridges already tinted pink, and planted himself directly across from Ryan's tray. "You gonna say anything today?" Itrix asked, jabbing one thick finger into Ryan's shoulder, hard enough to rock him sideways. "Or are you just gonna sit there being weird?" Ryan looked up. It was the first time in weeks anyone had seen him make direct eye contact with Itrix, and for a moment the whole table seemed to hold its breath, Merrick included, 3 seats down, fork frozen halfway to her mouth. Ryan's expression didn't shift. He just looked, steady and unreadable, for 2 full seconds. Then he lowered his gaze and went back to eating. "Yeah," Itrix said, satisfied like he'd won something. "Thought so." He hadn't won anything. Merrick understood that even before she understood why. There was something in the way Ryan's eyes had moved during that look, not at Itrix's face, but lower, at his throat, his shoulders, the gap between his secondary arms and his ribs, the way a person studies a door they're deciding whether to walk through. Merrick didn't say this out loud. Not yet. She filed it away the same way Ryan seemed to file everything and went back to her tray and told herself it was nothing. It was not nothing. That night, Ryan sat alone in his quarters and did the thing he did every night, which nobody on the station ever saw. He stretched his fingers, slow and deliberate, each knuckle in sequence, the same motion his uncle had taught him before he ever left Earth. His uncle had spent 11 years as an orbital recon operator before retiring to teach close-quarters response to civilian families headed off-world. His mother and his aunt were both licensed security specialists. Ryan had grown up around people who didn't talk about violence so much as they talked about geometry, leverage, the exact amount of force a body could absorb before something gave. None of that showed on the surface. That was the point. What showed on the surface was a quiet boy who never spoke, never reacted, never gave anyone a reason to escalate further than they already had. What was underneath was someone counting, every single day, exactly how much more he could take before the math stopped working in his favor. The next morning brought the first real shift in the pattern, though nobody recognized it as one at the time. Itrix's bloodline mates started bringing friends. 3 students instead of 2, then 4, a loose crowd that gathered whenever Itrix decided it was time to remind everyone what Ryan was or wasn't. A crowd needed an audience needed a show. "He's escalating because people are watching now," Merrick said to Fawn, the 2 of them at a corner table, deliberately not looking toward the center of the room where the gathering was happening again. "Maybe Ryan should just hit him back," Fawn said, not unkindly, the casual suggestion of someone who never had to calculate what hit back would cost a Deathworlder accused of attacking a minor of another species. "He can't," Merrick said, and was surprised by how certain she felt saying it. "If he reacts first, it's not self-defense anymore. It's a human attacking a crashing. That's not the same story to anyone watching." Vaughan went quiet at that, all 6 limbs still for once. It was the closest anyone on the station came to understanding the shape of what Ryan was doing, weeks before it mattered, and neither of them said anything more about it, because there was nothing to say. The system had taught Ryan exactly one lesson, over and over, in every closed complaint and every 4-minute wellness check, that he would only be believed once there was no other way to read what happened. The solvent incident's aftermath rippled forward in a smaller way nobody noticed. A faint chemical burn had bloomed along Ryan's forearm under his sleeve, never reported, never treated beyond the wipe he'd asked for in front of the instructor. He didn't mention it again. He wore long sleeves for the rest of the week, and Merrick, walking behind him to the dome one afternoon, caught a glimpse of red, raw skin at his wrist before the cuff slid back into place. She said nothing. She wasn't sure afterward why she hadn't. Mid-cycle recess arrived 8 days after the dining hall jab, on the day everything finally tipped. The hall was crowded, louder than usual, the kind of noise that made it easy for one more voice to disappear into it. Etrix approached from behind this time, his bloodline mates and their growing audience trailing a few steps back, dorsal ridges flared dark red. The color-crashing physiology turned at the edge of real anger rather than performance. He leaned down close to Ryan's ear, close enough that nobody else heard the words, not even Merrick, 3 tables away with her fork frozen again, watching the shape of it happen the way you watch weather arrive. Whatever Etrix said, Ryan's hand, which had been resting flat on the table for the entire meal, curled slowly into a fist. He didn't stand up. He didn't say anything back. He simply sat there, fist closed, eyes forward, and the room kept talking around him, oblivious, while something in Ryan's chest finished a calculation that had been running for months. Merrick would not learn what Etrix had said until much later, in a sterile room with a privacy field humming overhead, and when she finally did hear it, she would understand, with a kind of cold clarity, exactly why the next 4 seconds happened the way they did. "I could break every joint in your body," Etrix had whispered, close enough that his breath carried the mineral stink of crashing saliva, "and nobody here would even blame me for it." That was the whole of it. 11 words, low and certain, the kind of thing said by someone who had never once been told no and didn't expect to start now. Ryan's arm came up before the sentence finished. His elbow drove into the soft cartilage under Etrix's jaw, a short, brutal arc that used almost no visible effort, and the sound that followed was small and wet and absolute. Etrix's knees buckled first. Then his whole frame folded sideways across the table, secondary arms spasming once, dorsal ridges draining from red to a sick, pale grey. The crowd that had gathered for the show went silent the way a room goes silent when it realizes it is no longer watching a show. Ryan sat back down. He exhaled through his nose, slow, the way someone does after setting down something heavy they've carried a long way. His hands had not left the table the entire time, before or after. He reached into his jacket and drew out the same folded square of polyfilm he'd been carrying for weeks, laid it flat in front of him, and raised his hand the way he always raised it in class when he wanted to be called on. "I'd like to report a defense incident," he said, "justified under Article 7, Clause 4. Nobody moved. Merrick stood frozen by the drink dispensers, the same place she'd been standing the first time, except now she understood she wasn't watching the first time at all. She was watching the only time it had ever needed to happen. Security arrived within 90 seconds, and the next 20 minutes blurred into procedure. Medics sliding stasis film under Etrix's collapsed frame, students herded out in staggered groups, a junior officer asking Ryan to remain seated, which he did, hands folded, like he'd been asked to wait for a bus. He did not stand up once, not when the medics worked, not when the room cleared around him, not until an officer finally touched his shoulder and told him it was time to come with her. Inquiry Room 2 had no restraints, just a privacy field humming overhead, soft blue light pulsing along the seams of the wall. Dean Holloway sat across from Ryan with a Balkan ethics monitor beside her, all flat grey patients, and a jury counselor named Tessio who hadn't said a word yet. "Are you trained in lethal joint manipulation?" Dean Holloway asked. "I'm trained in non-lethal restraint," Ryan said. "Lethality depends on target physiology. I didn't know crashing cervical structure would respond that way until it happened." It wasn't quite true, and it wasn't quite a lie either. Ryan had known exactly where crashing vertebrae sat closest to the surface, the same way he'd known where to aim a wrist lock or a knee strike, because his mother had drilled cross-species anatomy into him before he ever left Earth, the same way other parents taught their kids to swim. Your file says you filed 2 complaints, the Vulcan monitor said, voice flat and grinding, sliding a translucent slate across the table. Both closed without escalation. Yes, Ryan said. Why didn't you file a 3rd? Ryan looked at the slate instead of at any of them. Because the first 2 taught me what a 3rd would do. Nothing. I needed something the system couldn't close in 2 days. Dean Holloway's mouth tightened. She didn't argue. This was the moment Merrick, watching through the observation glass with Fawn pressed silent beside her, finally understood the shape of the thing she'd been circling for months. Ryan hadn't waited because he was afraid. He'd waited because the system had only one lever that worked, and that lever required someone to get hurt first, badly enough, publicly enough, that nobody could call it anything but self-defense. If I'd reacted early, Ryan said, still looking at the slate, they'd have seen a human attacking a Crashine. That's not self-defense to anyone watching. That's species escalation. That's the headline. That's the diplomatic incident. I waited because if I didn't, I'd be the villain. Tessio finally spoke, soft and careful. And the polyfilm, you carried it for how long? 6 weeks, Ryan said, since the second complaint closed. 6 weeks of folding it into his pocket every morning, the way other kids checked their schedules. 6 weeks of knowing, with a kind of grim certainty, that the day was coming, and the only thing left to control was how he'd be ready for it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the Vulcan monitor set the slate down. The report will reflect justified self-defense, he said. Crashing cervical vulnerability under blunt trauma was not adequately documented in interspecies safety briefings. This is being flagged as an institutional gap, not a student offense. It should have felt like winning. Ryan's face didn't change at all. Outside, in the hallway, Merrick caught Dean Holloway before she reached her office, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. He filed 2 complaints, Merrick said. I read them after. They weren't vague. He named it tricks both times. He named what happened. Nobody followed up. Dean Holloway stopped walking. For a moment, she looked older than Merrick had ever seen her look, the kind of tired that comes from being handed proof of a failure you suspected but never confirmed. I know, she said. I've already pulled the file. It wasn't an apology. It was close enough to one that Merrick let it sit, unanswered, and walked away before either of them had to find more words for it. The station shifted in small, visible ways over the following days, the kind of changes that come only after something breaks loudly enough to be impossible to ignore quietly. Patrol cycles through the dining hall doubled. A new mediation office opened in the administrative dome, staffed by an actual counselor instead of an automated form. Etrix's case file was forwarded to a curriculum review board. His physiology added as a new entry in the cross-species safety briefings every incoming student would now be required to read. None of it undid 6 weeks of a folded square of polyfilm sitting in a teenager's pocket. Etrix survived. His spine would need 3 separate surgical interventions and a transfer to a specialized care facility 2 systems away, a fact that traveled through the station in hushed, half-drew versions within hours. Some students said Ryan had trained as a soldier back on Earth. Some said he'd been planning it for a year. The truth, smaller and stranger than either rumor, never quite caught up to the story everyone preferred. Merrick found herself standing outside Ryan's quarters 3 days after the inquiry closed, unsure why she'd walked there at all. The door opened before she knocked, like he'd heard her stop in the corridor. You can come in, Ryan said, or you can keep standing there. Either's fine. It was the first time he'd spoken to her directly, unprompted, since she'd known him. Something about the offer, plain and unbothered, cracked open a question she hadn't planned on asking. Why didn't you ever tell anyone what you were carrying? Merrick asked. Not even me. Ryan considered this for a moment, leaning against the doorframe, his fingers moving in that same slow, deliberate stretch she'd seen once before through a window and never understood until now. Because the moment I told someone, he said, it stops being a defense and starts being a plan. And plans get you expelled before they get you justified. Merrick didn't answer right away. She stood in the doorway, turning the line over, the way Ryan seemed to turn everything over before he let it go. That's a sad way to live, she said finally. It worked, Ryan said. There was no defensiveness in it, just the flat statement of someone reporting a result. Working isn't the same as good, I know that. He stepped back from the door, an invitation, and Merrick crossed the threshold for the first time. The room was almost bare. A few changes of uniform folded with the same precision he folded his hands. No personal items on the shelves, except one small framed image, turned slightly away from the door, of three adults standing in front of a transport gate. Your family, Merrick said. My mother, my aunt, my uncle. Ryan didn't elaborate further, didn't need to. Merrick had already pieced together enough from the inquiry, the cross-species anatomy, the muscle memory that didn't belong to a teenager who'd never been in a real fight before. People who treated violence like geometry didn't raise children who treated it like instinct. They raised children who treated it like math, solved quietly, years in advance. Will you go back to them? Merrick asked. I'm transferring out next cycle, Ryan said. Different station, closer to the soul relay. He paused, fingers stretching once, slow, knuckle by knuckle. The ritual Merrick now understood for exactly what it was. Not a tick, a reset. Dean Holloway recommended it, said it wasn't punishment, said it was distance. Is it? Probably both. 3 weeks later, almost to the day Ryan had first told her, the alerts ran through the station's environmental feed. Atmospheric simulation, seasonal variance, initiating. Synthetic snow began to fall through the observation dome's upper vents, soft white flecks drifting down through filtered light, dissolving into vapor a meter above the floor before they ever touched anything solid. Of course, it wasn't real snow. Nothing on Harmony Station was real in the way Earth things were real. But it fell the same way regardless, slow and quiet, and most of the students who gathered to watch it had never seen snow at all, not even the fake kind, not even on a screen. Ryan stood near the edge of the observation deck, packed bag already sitting by the transport gate 2 corridors away, watching flakes vanish an arm's length from his face. Merrick found him there, the way she'd found herself finding him more often these last 3 weeks, without quite deciding to. She didn't say anything for a while. Neither did he. The simulation hummed overhead, and somewhere below them, the station carried on its careful business. 39 species moving through corridors that had, in small, unglamorous ways, gotten a little safer since a quiet boy stopped waiting. They added crashing anatomy to the safety briefing, Merrick said eventually. Cervical structure, pressure points. It's required reading for new students now. I heard. Ryan's voice was even, the way it had always been. Trix's name isn't on it. No, just the species data. Good, Ryan said, and Merrick understood, without him explaining it, that this was the closest thing to mercy he had left to give. Not forgiveness, not forgetting. Just the quiet decision not to make a single body into a permanent lesson plan, even a body that had earned it. A flake drifted close enough that Merrick reached out without thinking, fingers closing on empty, cold air where the white had already become nothing. You waited 5 years, she said, not a question. I waited until I had no other move, Ryan said. That's different from patience. People keep calling it patience. It wasn't. It was running out of options slower than everyone expected. He turned to look at her then. The first time in this whole conversation, his eyes had left the snow. Sometimes restraint is the only thing that keeps people from fearing us more than they already do, he said. I'm not saying that to sound wise. I'm saying it because it's the only reason I didn't move sooner. If I'd snapped at the first shove, every species on this station would still be telling stories about the Deathworlder who couldn't be trusted near children. And now they tell a different story, one where I waited too long instead of not long enough. He looked back at the dissolving flakes. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to be true. The transport alert chimed somewhere down the corridor, soft and procedural, indifferent to the weight of the moment, the way Harmony Station systems always were. Ryan didn't move toward it yet. There was no rush. There never really had been, not once, not even in the 4 seconds it took to end something that had been building for months. "What you did," Merrick said, "was it worth it?" Ryan was quiet long enough that Merrick thought he might not answer at all. "Etrix gets to walk again in 4 months," he said finally. "I get to leave a station where nobody calls me weak anymore. Neither of those things makes the 6 weeks I carried that polyfilm okay. They just mean it's over." It was the most honest thing he'd said since the day the snow started falling, and Merrick understood it would probably be the last honest thing he said to her, too, because honest things didn't travel well across transport gates and new postings, and the careful, practiced distance people like Ryan kept between themselves and anyone who'd watched them at their worst. They sat in silence for a while after that, watching synthetic snow dissolve in midair, two figures small against the dome's curved glass, the station's manufactured winter falling soft and brief and gone before it could ever become anything you could hold. Ryan stood eventually, slung his bag over one shoulder, and looked back once. "Thanks for not asking why before," he said. "Everyone else just asked why. You asked what it cost." Then he walked toward the transport gate, posture even, hands loose. The same unhurried pace he'd used crossing every corridor on this station for 5 years, and didn't look back again. Merrick stayed at the dome a long time after the gate had closed behind him, long enough to watch the simulated snowfall taper off into nothing, the vents sealing overhead, the dome's filtered light settling back into its ordinary gold. No one ever called him weak again. And none forgot he never even stood up until the very end.